So now it's been, 7 years since the referendum in June of 2016. And that shock, which I still recall waking up early on that day to find out that the British public had voted to leave. And it's just over 3 years since Boris Johnson got it done. You know, that slogan that we lived with for so long. We're talking obviously about Brexit. And looking at the state of the country today, whether it be economically, whether it be in terms of, for so long we talked about social cohesion. We talked about harmony, we talked about tolerance, and we talked about... But it seems that British society is divided across racial, ideological, political divides like at least I can't remember. The economic situation, the cost of living crisis is hitting millions of people, millions of households up and down the country. And it's creating a class system between the rich, the ultra rich, and the rest who make up about 85% of society. I mean, I was reading in, I think it was The Independent, only a few months ago, about the impact of the pandemic on British society. And one of the criteria that they mentioned was that during the year and a half or 2 years almost of lockdown, Britain gained another 23 billionaires, 23 individuals who joined the billionaires club, with almost 2 million people coming ever so closer to the poverty line. And that, I think, is, something that we need to pay attention to. What's happening in terms of that class system that we're creating. So Brexit and what impact we're seeing throughout the country, as well as obviously across Europe. It's something truly distressing, I would suggest.
Well, I think it's been a catastrophic sort of case of self-harm, really, and you can see the ramifications for that, for society, as you've just indicated, in social division. You have divisions between young and old and different faiths in different parts of the country. And the geographical divide between, say, the north and the south, particularly London, and how London's perceived in other parts of the country. I think that's been really, really bad. It's been really toxic, all this Brexit, for, as you say, for 7 years. For what? As you look at it now, you think, well, what was this ever set to achieve? And what is it achieving for this country now? It doesn't feel like it's achieved anything but division. Our trade's down. People are not coming to this country in the way that they used to. I do some work with the European Network on Religion and Belief. We're trying to get some professors over here to look at the issues around migration and refugees. And we're organising something in Middlesbrough, tough town in the northeast, which voted very heavily for Brexit, actually. And people said, we don't want to come to this country. It's not a very pleasant place. They see all the imagery that's associated with our country at the moment. And I feel very sad about that. They say, we can't, we've got to get the visas. It's all very difficult, Mark. So I don't know whether we're going to be able to do that piece of work in June. I'll just give you a practical example. So,
I mean, not to sound flippant, Oliver, but we do now have navy blue passports. Yeah. So I guess we did get something out of Brexit.
Thankfully, my UK passport is still European colour, and I have an Irish passport also, which I take pride when I travel.
Didn't we hear about lines of people at the Irish embassy trying to reclaim a citizenship because they had a gran or they had
a... I heard was something like 6 million.
As soon as Brexit.
That's a great thing, because it means that people feel European.
Yeah.
And they still want to belong. I feel very sad for those who were drifting into Brexit without being aware of any of the consequences, and not aware of the economic consequences, the social consequences. And now I think we're being let down very badly because there isn't an honest discussion. They're trying to say we're in the mess we're in now because of the pandemic. We're not in the mess because of the pandemic. The pandemic just prolonged the impact that Brexit would have. Look at 600 thousand, is it, workspaces
Yeah.
now for essential jobs in Britain unfilled and will go on unfilled. Because who wants to work in a country where you don't feel you want it?
Who was it that said in Parliament, that said that thousands upon thousands of tons of crop, of vegetables and fruits and the such, went rotted and because they went unpicked, because of the thousands who used to come to the country and be paid tippins every hour, but essentially get, you know, the harvest out of and onto, you know, the supermarket shelf.
But look at what's going on at the moment. The nurses' dispute and the hospitals and the NHS and the ambulance drivers. How many of us recall the bus going around saying Brexit will have, I forget the
50 million a day or
something for the NHS,
ridiculous.
a total fictitious figure. But, you know, that deception. And now, how many of the people who voted for breakfast, or
Breakfast.
probably the right name.
That would have been a better thing to vote for, actually, wouldn't it?
It would have actually. We're without the breakfast now because of Brexit. But if how many of those people honestly ask today, where is that money? Why have we been lied to? Why isn't that put into giving the nurses the right pay, supporting the ambulance
And why
drivers?
isn't anyone held accountable for making that claim, that lie, as you put it? And you know, either at least being voted out of office, at the very, very least, but at most, it's something that actually created the chaos that we find ourselves in today.
But I think the roots of our problem, Anas, and I'm giving away my age now, was in the 60s, 70s, particularly when we voted to go into Brexit. When we voted to go into Brexit, it's on our, when we voted to go into the EU, we made no preparation whatsoever. I remember the discussion then was, and I'm going back now to, I was in a parish in Islington, and the big discussion was, what's the model we build our society on? Is it the soup bowl or is it the salad bowl? And the whole, I thought, forward way of looking was the salad bowl, because you allowed people to keep their identity. You didn't want this sort of assimilation where people lost their identity, because in so doing, they were losing what they could contribute to society. But I feared that was never properly worked through. And I used to be scandalized, really, by finding second-generation Polish, second-generation or third or fourth-generation Italians unable to speak their mother tongue. And it was because the parents or grandparents had felt, oh, we must assimilate. We must lose our Italian identity. We must lose our Polish identity. I'm mentioning those two communities because they're the largest. And so I remember in our school, we said, no, we've got to encourage the mother language of the children in the school. So we'd have Portuguese classes after school, Spanish classes, and then as the new migration happened, Tigrinya for Eritrean, Tagalog for Filipino, so that young people could grow up proud of their identity. And in that way, they were contributing to the society. Sadly, that model wasn't taken on. In fact, it was seen as a threat. You'd have to argue with teachers over it that, oh, they won't speak their mother tongue properly. So I think we joined the union without looking clearly at the implications for society and how we could help society to be enriched by being part of a greater communion than...
I mean, we must admit that there was a sense of being threatened, to be overrun. I mean, that was the kind of sense that you got from the debate that preceded the vote in 2016, that the country was almost under siege. The country was about to be, as one very close friend of mine used to say, we're going to be overrun by a German-French superstate. You know, those kinds of claims, they did take grip. How, though? I mean, how did so many people become so convinced of this?
Well, political lying has become an art form, isn't it? And we've got some really good political liars. You've got to admit that. We've had, Farage, we've had Johnson, we have Rees-Mogg. All these people are really good at lying and telling big lies. And, who said, if you tell a big lie and you tell it often enough, it gets believed. And I think it also, though, fits in with that kind of exceptionalism that we have as a country, that somehow, we got the word great in front of it. I don't think there are many other countries that do that, And if you come into Stansted now, the word great is actually huge. And Britain, you think, hang on a minute, what sort of state am I living in? But it was about dividing people up, as I said earlier, into, Portuguese, which is my heritage, who were picking the crops up in the fenlands. That's our breadbasket in this country, and the Romanians and the Bulgarians and the Poles in the East Anglia where I live. They were really contributing to the economy and to our food.
Yeah.
To having food. Now, look at what's happened to the price of food.
Yeah.
Look what the cost of living feels like for a lot of those people that were deceived by that. And it was a great deception. There's nothing to show for it, is there? For in any region, for any class, for any ethnic group, there's nothing there. But as you rightly say, people got that storm going. We had a refugee crisis. We're going to have lots of refugee crises, actually. With climate change, there's going to be a lot of people migrating to survive. And we had a Syrian wave. You will recall in, was it 2014, 15, 16, that Farage really, that was big posters, it was all breaking apart, because we had people fleeing for their lives, actually, that needed our care and protection. And that fed into that narrative around there being maybe a large number of East Europeans in certain towns and cities, or whatever. And it kind of got that whole thing going. And we've had that kind of racist politics, for decades and generations.
It leads me to wonder whether the whole argument regarding breakfast.
Oliver, breakfast keeps coming up.
You've now. I've caught
Sorry,
it.
Anas.
I've caught it. Regarding Brexit, the whole argument. What was the overriding theme? Was it ideological? Was it economic? Was it political? What was it? Was it racial? I mean, what was it? Why? I mean, what drove the argument either for or against? Because, I mean, it's fascinating how we find that the impact of Brexit has been so severe, so severe. I don't think that many, I'd like to say most, but many of those who voted to leave actually considered possible. And that's why we have these sort of impressions that if we were to have a vote today, that the vote would be somewhat different. But what was the backbone of the argument? Was it ideological?
Divided society. I think the divisions in British society, and I think part of the roots were in the miners' strike. If you go back to the miners' strike, where vibrant villages and little towns and communities were suddenly ghost towns or villages, and young people had to migrate from their to get work and so forth. And we never leveled up. We never took care enough of keeping a social cohesion in terms of economic equality and so forth. So those who left behind, I feared, felt that the reason they were left behind, one, because the country had become a soft touch for scroungers coming in, forgetting that there were genuine asylum seekers, people whose lives were at risk and were risking their lives coming here. And secondly, the new workforce coming in that were taking our jobs. Now, that, I think, opened the way for the liar politician to see the opportunity to exploit for their own self-gain. So we were taken over by opportunists. I'm working for the country. No, I'm working for my own self-enrichment. And I think that a lot of the people, I don't want regulation, I don't want rules from Europe. The way I can get around these is to actually focus on the problem are immigrants, the problem are asylum seekers, and not looking at the facts that actually the people coming into the country were a net gain for the country. It was they, through their hard work, their initiative, all the new things they brought into the country, it was they who were providing the social security, who were keeping the national health alive. Look at when when the pandemic hit. The number of, just focusing in, Muslim doctors, Muslim health workers who were on the front line in saving tens of thousands of lives. Prior to the reality, what were we given? Oh, they're a threat. You know, this is I think there's a period of accountability we should have when the statements and the programs and the articles and the media that were responsible for creating this sort of division, they should be held to account.
And by the way, I mean, it's interesting that Oliver mentioned the fact that, and I have it even on my Twitter feed, that the very first 5 or 6 health carers, from doctors to nurses and the such, were actually Muslim. And you're absolutely right. We have tens of thousands of Muslims, as well as other faiths and such, and minorities, who hold up the NHS at a time when there are actual hammers blowing at every single side of it, trying to crush it to nothing. And this, I think, is one of the untold impacts of Brexit. I recall during the 90s, probably since Labour came to power in 1995, 1997, and for about 12, 15 years, we had multiculturalism as being something celebrated. We were on the tube and seeing how posters about how London being so diverse and so different, and that we're 7 million individuals and that we come from various colors and faiths and cultures and all of that. And it was to be celebrated. But then crept in the sort of line that actually multiculturalism is bad. And those who support multiculturalism ought to be, they should.
They were a liberal metropolitan elite, weren't they?
And it seems that there was a drawback from that, and a creation of a totally different kind of atmosphere.
And it was to be celebrated, but there was no effort to actually help it become what it could be. There was no plan, there was no policy.
To solidify it.
It was
to cement it.
It was multiculturalism where communities lived alongside each other without the level of engagement. We didn't create the community spaces. We didn't celebrate the differences. We talked about multiculturalism as if it was a mosaic or something. Everyone had to fit in to a thing, rather than saying this is a wonderful city and country of differences, and to celebrate that and the enrichment of society that it brought. We lost that. Politicians just talked about it, but didn't implement it in the way
and
it
some
could have been.
Actually fought it. Some actually went against it.
Well, I think that fits in with that exceptionalism that we have, that somehow we're special. It relates back to empire. It relates back to how we see other people with different colour skin and different faith. It really relates back to that. And I mean, the weaponising of anti-Muslim hate, which I think you've sort of touched on there, I think the Conservatives saw that as really being a good vote winner. Yeah, and you could then segue that into refugees, because we talk about Syria. Most of them were from Muslim backgrounds. If you look at that, a lot of refugees are fleeing countries for climate change from a Muslim perspective. So I think they saw that as something they could weaponise. And then if you look at some of those northern cities that voted very heavily for Brexit, they were very racially and divided and divided on religious grounds. And I think some politicians from the far right have seen that route to some easy votes, where you don't have to explain anything to certain constituents. You just do some dog whistling, and they're behind you, And then, so they didn't think through Brexit, did they? You said, where has it come from? It was just a feeling. Maybe it was a howl of rage. Maybe it was a howl of confusion. Why is the country like this now? And I think, if you go to, as I say, to places like Burnley or up in, in those Lancashire mill towns around Greater Manchester, what's going wrong? And why has London got all the wealth or all the riches? Well, it's physically closer to Europe. It's got a different heritage. You could explain things away. You can actually try and do things in a kind of critical thinking person's way. But they're not going for any of that. They're just going for scapegoats and making it easy. And they'll move on. Now one of Sunak's five, it's unbearable, it's unbearable. 5 things, important things, trying to stop a few people in boats, a few refugees, risking their whole life. I mean, it just makes me well up, really,
the
that we've got
of the Home Secretary are absolutely despicable.
Right.
Despicable.
It's almost like Brexit as being a second Reformation. If you think pre-Reformation, the historical Reformation, you had Europe united in the sense people could travel, church people went there, here. There was a united Europe, a sense of community or whatever.
Yeah.
Brexit broke that, or the Reformation initially broke that. Now, post-war, the horror of nationalism, the horror of excessive nationalism, brought people like Robert Schuman to see the need for some sort of principles where we could recreate a certain unity. Now, from my knowledge, they were very much shaped in Catholic social teaching, and that the core founders of the European Union were people not just horrified by what they witnessed happening in Europe through nationalism, but also a vision that was based on justice, based on love, and based on openness, all of these qualities. And they tried to shape the Union on it. And I think that succeeded to some degree. I think as it expanded, we lost.
I mean, the idea as an idea is quite unique.
The ideal was great. And central to their thinking was the principle of Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity. And that basically meant that the centre empowered the regional.
Right.
Instead of the centre controlling the regional, you brought your resources together, your know-how together, so that you could actually enrich and empower the local. Now, in the process, we lost that. And again, I'm just, this is a way out thinking, but as I reflect on it, I think in a way, what we started as the Union expanded, we saw the division in interpretation of law. Northern Europeans tend to go by what I would say the letter of the law. The letter of the law is to be applied. Southern Europeans with a sort of more Catholic interpretation of law, it's the spirit of the law that matters. So you could bend the letter to keep the spirit. I think these are issues that we lost sight of, and at the very core of what we should be now, not as a European, but a universal society, a global society we have become.
Well, now we have the government saying we are going to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. I mean, I was in Brussels last week with the European Commission, and they've got an initiative called the Anti-Racism Agenda, and it's a whole body of work. Each of the EU countries got to come up with an anti-racist plan. They've got an anti-Islamophobia coordinator. She's only just been appointed. You might want to interview her in the future. They are really focused around tackling tackling racism, because they can see the threat this brings to all of our politics and to the way of life that we've had as liberal democracies. There are a lot of states in Europe that are a great threat here from this rise of the far right, because of this rise of language, of division.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's as though the kind of language that was used leading up to the referendum in 2016, the language was something that we had, I personally had read about the kind of language from, the rivers of blood and the such from the 60s. And it was something that we read as though it was in the past, and we as a society, as a collective, had moved on. But all of a sudden, we were hearing it once again. We were reading it as headlines in the press.
Our Home Secretary.
Very much so. I mean, it was government. It wasn't just the nutters on the fringes.
Yeah.
I recall, for instance, in around 2004, 2005, the British National Party, led by Nick Griffin, calling out for all its members to come and march in Leeds. And something like 220 people turned out. It was nothing. But then, only a few years on, that kind of rhetoric, that kind of narrative was winning votes, was winning seats in parliaments, not only in the UK,
Dagenham, they won
but across Europe.
Anas,
it's as though, if I may, it's as though it was, the first sort of break in the dam. It was as though, something was being held back, but all of a sudden, it became okay. It wasn't just the BNP. All of a sudden, it was government ministers. It was people who are daily on our screens or writing daily on our newspapers. So it became okay. And for that, all of a sudden, we found this deluge of similar rhetoric and narrative, not only across Europe, across Britain, but also in the continent.
What I find deeply offensive about her language and Priti Patel's and a number of others is, I think back to when I was 10, 11, I was brought up in this area, Acton. And I remember the whole Ugandan Asian crisis.
Yes.
And I remember people then having sort of racist attitudes. I remember demonstrations in the street saying, we have enough Asians, keep them out. There was no way. They were protesting against the government of the day, bringing Asians in. They're going to create all sorts of problems. And then Southall was beginning to develop and they said, we have enough, we don't want more. Now, thank God we had an enlightened government that had a sense of responsibility for people, that put people's protection and humanity before any other consideration, and welcomed them. And they came in and they protected us from the supermarket. They put the resources and know-how and everything into keeping small communities alive by running community shops, contributing to society in that way. I find it deeply, deeply disturbing that the first or second generation of those people is now the very people who are most vocal in saying we protect our borders, we exclude, I find it deeply offensive. What happens in the human person that you forget your roots? I'm an immigrant. I came here an economic immigrant at the age of 10 to work through all of those challenges. I think I've contributed in different ways to British society and happy to do so. I haven't lost my identity. When the rugby play, I clearly...
You fail the cricket test.
Shirt.
You fail the cricket test.
Strangely, the cricket test, I'm okay with English cricket because, but rugby, no, I have a clear identity. But the point, Anas, I think it's disturbing how, and it happens to lots of migrant groups, that you become assimilated in a way that you feel threatened by a new intake of a stranger. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things we've got to look at in society. It's horrific when you see it in our political leadership.
Yes.
Because you would think that people elected to office would go for the common good of society, would keep the basic human values and uphold those values. And as Mark mentioned earlier in our conversation, really disturbing now, they're attacking the whole European Court, which for many of us, we say thank God for it.
Absolutely.
Because it's a protection.
Probably one of the most instrumental and important establishments that's were set up for the last generation or so.
It really is a horror, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, as Oliver's touched on, I mean, this creation of, I call it like false narratives, and they're far right extreme narratives. And we've had a takeover. I mean, the government's been hijacked by extreme right-wing people. I'm not really that interested too much about where their background is and the colour of their skin, but they are driving a very hard right agenda, which I think will be to absolute detriment of this country, and we're feeling that right now. And it's like the Daily Mail every day is writing the script for the ministers, isn't it? I cast my mind back, and we've done lots of work over many years on this, around integrated communities, for example. And even with Theresa May, do you remember her?
Yes.
I mean, she seems like a wonderful, moderate human being now.
Absolutely.
She had a policy called the Integrated Communities Policy, and they were working, because, you know, we're saying we need more social mixing between different ethnicities and people from different religions. We need not parallel lines, you know, in some of the cities you can get people living very distinct lives and not mixing really, not in schools, obviously not in the mosque, not in the church, and bringing people together. She had a whole load of policies there, and it was funded. It was a program called Near Neighbours that brought together churches and mosques and temples. So all that gone. It's all gone in the bin. There's nothing there. So there's not any government policy now that's actually trying to champion, as you were talking earlier, about the values of community cohesion and being one planet and one society. It's all gone, and it's gone for ideological reasons. And as you say, some people are picking that up. In Europe, Sweden, we've got some fascists.
Yes.
You know, Italy, we've got some fascists. God knows what happened in France
Sweden
next time.
only, you know, something like 8-10 years ago, it was cast as probably one of the most open, one of the most liberal, one of the most welcoming and warm nations in the entire world. All of a sudden now we have, you know, a far-right government that's, like Mark is saying, is, you know, hell-bent on trying to limit and restrict societies and communities, minorities, to express themselves, express their cultures, express their identity and religion.
But picking up on something you said, Mark, earlier about what's going on in Europe now, the anti-racism and looking into this, I think, you know, I hope to look at it in two ways. One is the level of individuals. Okay, how do you deal with individuals who either inherently racist or whatever? And that's how do we deal with that as a society. But how do you deal with a government who promotes a different type of racism?
Yeah.
Now, we're told that maybe tomorrow, the next day, the new Prevent review will come out. And what has been leaked through the sort of papers that are promoting division is, I think, appalling. That it's going to stigmatize again
Islamic
4 million of our British community are going to be stigmatized. They're going to be seen as fifth columnists. That's basically what this Prevent whole thing, totally misconceived, but going to be endorsed through what I would say hack journalism. Someone with drive-by analysis, touch on this community, that, take one or two perceptions and have endorsed a prejudice against. Now, I would hope that will also be tackled. We can't talk about racism in communities unless we see it also in the actual, you might say, the deep state that is influencing our political life and influencing our media life and, in fact, shaping Britain in a way that's alien to it. As but what I really think what is lacking in the whole concept of Prevent and what it has done in the years since it's been introduced is a total lack of what I would say British history and British values, because none of them seem to be aware of the penal laws, where the state presumed that it could come in and take over an individual conscience, and if the conscience didn't agree with the national perception of what religion should be, orthodox religion, then worst you were hanged, drawn and quartered, or you were exiled, or you were impoverished. You know, now it took centuries for Britain to discover that's not the approach. It took centuries for them to recognize there's a red line between government and government's responsibilities and a religious community, a faith community, and that in that there has to be diversity. We have, in the last 10 years, driven a horse and cart right through that. And now it's being perpetuated. And I think we're instead of upholding British values, actually policies have
And
undermined.
it's anti the evidence. It's anti-intellectual, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of anti-clever, really.
But
because all the extremism is I've been touching on is from the far right. It's often lone wolves, as they call it. Yep. People are just kind of confused and messed up. Those are the areas. But for the government, they think it, as I said, it's weaponising anti-Muslim hate. And they feel like it gives them results. And you have seen that in other European countries, in Austria, and the fantastic professor, I'm sure you've had him on, actually. Yes, hounded out of Austria.
Of course.
And he does the regular, Islamophobia reports across Europe. Those, they know it works. Yeah. So they don't even need the evidence for it. I think there will be a lot of our colleagues and fellow citizens that will be very, very upset if those rumours are true, and they're going to perpetuate that kind of prevent strategy, which doesn't work, and it criminalises or potentially criminalises a section of the community.
And it's. I mean, now we've touched on prevent, and obviously this is a very big story where, whilst we're recording this, we're still awaiting the report to come out.
I think there's been sufficient leaks through.
To see what a hack job, as you've put it, it is, and that's unfortunate because I think there could have been an opportunity to step back, to readdress the mistakes of the past 18 years or so. I think that. What's been done is to the detriment of our society as a whole. I mean, the whole concept that Prevent was built upon was to make society safer, was to make society more cohesive, to open up people to each other. That was initially what was told about Prevent. It was that kind of strategy, and therefore the very first elements of Prevent were supporting young boys' football clubs or a girls' cricket team and the such, and it sounded all hunky-dory. But soon after, it became clear that it was about looking at particularly the Muslim community through security lens. Yeah. So all of a sudden you have this large chunk of British society, which amounts to about 3 to 5%, being seen with extreme suspicion, with extreme trepidation. I mean, how could you function as a society, whether it be economically or whether it be politically, when you have that sort of wide and large section of society being looked upon in those particular lenses? And the evidence is, just like you said, Mark, that it's anti-logic, it's anti-smart. The data and the figures that are clear, that are produced by the Home Office itself, every single year shows an increase in what they see as being extremism or fundamentalism or violence or terrorism even, year upon year upon year, which means that basically it does not work. It does not work. And then came the review. And there was some hope that maybe there would be a readdress of the very fundamentals that brought about this policy, about the evidence that we've had over the past 12, 13 years, and maybe we need to do things differently. Maybe we need to find something else. But then we find that, unfortunately, the report we're about to see is a cementation of the same idiocy. And
we've got to, get our country back. We've got to get our government and state back from this extremism.
A handful of
That's what we've got to do. Yeah. I mean, just kind of a bit tangential, but it is important. A lot of the universities, Cambridge and Oxford certainly, got a lot of money from the European Horizon programme.
Yes.
They've lost all of that. It is an anti-clever, anti-intellectual government, and they just pull those sort of strings. And when Oliver was talking earlier, I was reminded they got rid of all of those One Nation Conservatives. Do you remember it?
Yeah.
During this
Yes,
Brexit debacle, you know, Anas Altikriti and Damien
Alistair
Gray.
Burke,
all the
Nicholas
kind
Soame,
of, they would have been absolutely, you know, square with you in wanting to have a cohesive society that kind of worked, that recognised there were injustice and how do we put this right, you know? A kind of Edmund Burke view of you know, of how you improve things, you know, kind of gradually, and you learn on experience. Now we've just got, you know, right-wing radicals who tear everything up. Don't examine or analyse the evidence and come out with tin pots, sort of Daily Mail tropes, really.
Solution. But just picking up on Anas's comments on Prevent, very early on, before Prevent took hold, we were working at creating better understanding for Muslim communities, and we had the slogan, you know, there shouldn't be an institution in the country where a Muslim feels they have to leave their faith at the doorstep. I think it was a picturesque way of describing what you were achieving. So there should be understanding that a person of any faith has space there to be and to function and to contribute. Now, that was picked up by the Home Office very early on, and with the communities, we established a program whereby we took sometimes 30, 40 civil servants overnight from all different areas of the civil service into the communities. And they would stay overnight, they would meet the communities, they would learn about the faith. William Nye was the chief operator of this in the Home Office at the time. Now, William moved on. A new person, Charles Farr, the late Charles Farr, and I speak with respect for him, but I think what he did was very damaging. We had taken about 400 civil servants into the community. We didn't take a halfpenny from the Home Office because Esme Fairbairn Foundation was supporting our work, so we did it, you know, as part of our work, and we wanted to be seen as independent. Immediately, Farr took over. An intelligence gathering element came in. And I remember having a real row in the Home Office with him on this and with his advisors, who I think were worse, you know, that they were endorsing this and saying we can't work. And we had a letter exchange, and I heard subsequently from someone in the House of Lords that his private secretary resigned, or PA resigned, because the person agreed with me entirely. But the point was that it was introducing intelligence gathering, and we said we can't have anything to do with this. Now, when Lord Carlisle was appointed, I felt, okay, we need to engage in that. And my colleague Jordan Morgan and myself, we went and had a couple of hours with Lord Carlisle, just giving him our experience and sharing stories like this, saying these are not anecdotal. We've picked up, I could give numerous experience where actually there was intrusion. And Carlisle said to me in front of the team, I promise you one thing, listening to this, and I was quoting prominent members of the Lords and the Commons that were involved with us. So it wasn't sort of just, oh, here is a spectator talking. He said, I promise you one thing, I will follow the evidence. He said, I'm a lawyer and I will follow the evidence, I promise you. 4 days, 5 days later, we hear Carlisle is removed. And a journalist is that with known record of what would be seen as Islamophobic comments or anti-Islam, especially with the record in the Charities Commission, and look at the focus on Muslim charities. He is appointed. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's important to get these things out there for the record, because this is what has been going on for so long behind the scenes. And thank you, Anas, for the opportunity we have with Mark here to talk openly about that.
It's about how you reclaim that truth.
We
isn't it?
have to talk openly.
Away from that political line and the deceptions. Going back to your original point, how did Brexit happen? Well, it was all based on a whole load of falsehoods, lies, which we're living out.
Yeah.
And actually, it's our experience we're living it out. Social care, haven't got enough workers because people from the European Union aren't coming. In farming, we've got all these experiences. We've lost the funding for universities. We've lost the funding for social support in many areas. The European Social Fund was a huge fund for some of our poorest. Gone.
Yes.
All these things gone. And so we're living this experience. And we do not seem to have the political leaders to really galvanise that.
Yeah.
It should be a galvanic moment, shouldn't it, of saying, look at this mess, this chaos that we've caused. It's like, hands up in the air.
Wait for the real chaos to come.
What's the scenario?
Well,
the IMF showing up any minute now.
What I often use this for, we're obsessed with crossing the road. We're obsessed with the minicar coming this way that it might run us over, and forget that there's a big juggernaut coming the other way. Yeah. And it just seems to me that the inevitable of Brexit is the breakup of the United Kingdom. Yeah. And I say that because I remember going back some years, an Irish government official saying to me, Ireland had for 800 years been subservient to Westminster, to London, to the power, to the throne. And it created a sort of mentality, that if you're occupied for all of those years, you live with that mentality. And Irish officials, he said, in negotiations never felt equal with British, but until the European Union came.
Yeah.
And he said, suddenly sitting at table and realising you had one vote that was equal to
the United Kingdom.
The United Kingdom, he said, changed the whole negotiation pattern that enabled the Good Friday Agreement. He said, claimed there would never be possible to have it without that psychological shift. Now, the point I'm getting to, what has always protected, the United Kingdom has always been at risk when the dominant partner dominated over the other independent countries, well, independent in the sense separate nationalities in the kingdom, when one took dominance over the other. Did the United Kingdom vote to come out of the EU? No. Yeah. If you look at Scotland, if you look at Northern Ireland, it was forced out.
And if you look at certain cities, because I think the other implication of this, you have Bristol and London and Manchester and Oxford and Cambridge, all full of young people who are very anti-Brexit and can't believe that the older folk, if I put it that way, out in the suburbs or in the rural areas have imposed that on them. Yeah. Young people had freedom to travel, go to university. The world was their oyster.
Absolutely.
Now we've shrunk it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We've almost shrunk it. It feels like we've just shrunk it to England. If you're English and live in England, it's feeling really small and contained, isn't it? Almost like you're on this island and you can't get off. And I've got a niece who wanted to travel to the Netherlands to be with her boyfriend who's got a job over there. It's really difficult now.
Yeah.
Okay. She would have had the freedom of movement to do that. Yeah. And now and she's going, what's happening?
And I have to
she's
say,
28,
By the way, I've travelled. For the past since the opening of lockdown, I've travelled several times to Europe, and every single time I'm standing in a very long line, and you know what? There was a very almost farcical incident where I was in Belgium actually, and at Brussels airport, and there was this line that was never moving that we had to obviously join, and there was an official making sure that you're carrying British passports, stand in this line, don't go through the usual European line, which was absolutely empty and accessible. So we were standing there, and then someone complained. someone complains. They say, "What is this? Why are they treating us like this? Why?" And someone standing ahead of them looked back and said, "How did you vote in 2016?" And both the man and his partner just looked down and said absolutely nothing. Everyone burst out in laughter. It was a moment of relief and relieving that kind of tension that this is what you voted for. This is what was voted for.
Anas, you'll have to do some research into your background and find an Altikriti somewhere where you can. I heard the other day there's someone in America who's been some time looking into McTernan as a clan in the west of Ireland, you see, the Leitrim area in particular. And someone came up with the DNA, which said we probably were a black Asian minor tribe, southern Turkey, that migrated to Ireland 4,000 years ago. So, you know, what I'm saying is it's absurd when you think
it is
where we are.
But I think you get that Millwall in kind of tendency comes out with those sort of people. You know, everybody hates us, but we don't care. There's a kind of tribe thing that suddenly kicks in. Because you know, when you look at the statistics, I mean, it's still, was it 42% of people think it's the right? You know, okay, there's now a majority, but there isn't any chance of anything changing on that. And I think that's a big dilemma here.
Of course,
politically. We're stuck on this island, having made the worst decision ever, and it doesn't feel like we've got any way back or out of it. You know, you're going to be waiting in the longer queues. You know, you're going to have the trade problems. You're not going to have money for universities. You're not going to have people being able to come and work in the social care field, you know, for all these old people who voted Brexit anyway. So you think, what can you do now?
Why is
and my heart bleeds every time I do this. I'm like, what am I doing? You know?
Mark, why is the opposition not jumping on this? Why is Labour not, you know, wagging a finger?
Because they've never been truthful. I mean, I was in the Labour Party for 28, 29 years. I'll be honest with you there. I'm not in that party now. I mean, I'm in the Green Party. I've been in the Green Party for quite some time. And I just realised the Labour Party was never prepared to tell people the truth either, particularly its white working class vote in places like Hartlepool, if you know those traditional areas that would have always returned a Labour MP. They weren't telling them the truth. And global capitalism is tricky. Let's be honest. It squeezes people very badly. And it does certain things around the economy that have to be explained in a kind of intelligent, rational way. So I just don't think the Labour Party's got any wit about it at the moment, it seems to me, to actually challenge all of these things that we can see now in front of us. You know, when we're trying to even buy our leeks or our cauliflowers, and the cost of living crisis, you know, that presents itself on all these things. It's not there bashing away, telling people, look, we did make a mistake. We just have to own that mistake. We all make mistakes. We're human beings. We're imperfect, aren't we?